In this video, you're going to learn how to create this site using PHP, a sign-up page including validation that saves the details to a MySQL database, then a login and logout page. All the code developed in this video is freely available and a link is in the description. Let's start by creating the sign-up form. So let's create a new file called signup.html. We'll use the HTML suffix as this particular file won't contain any PHP. In here, we'll put the doc type, HTML, head and body tags. Inside the head element, let's add a title and a meta tag to specify the character set as UTF-8. Inside the body element, let's add a heading and a form tag. Inside the form, we'll start with a text input for the name and an associated label. We associate the label to the input with a for attribute on the label and an ID attribute on the input with the same value. We'll also add a name attribute to the input so that its value will be sent when the form is submitted. Finally, we'll wrap these two elements in a div element. This will show each label and input pair on a separate line, plus will also be useful later on when we add client-side validation. Next, let's add an email type input for the email address. As with the input above, we'll add an associated label, a name attribute, and we'll enclose this in a div tag. To keep it simple, we'll be using the email address to uniquely identify each user account. You can add a username if you prefer, in which case you'd need to add a text input to this sign-up form. Next, we'll add a password type input for the password. Again, as above, we'll add an associated label, a name attribute, and we'll enclose this in a div tag. Before we go any further, let's see how this looks so far. If we open this file in the browser, there's the heading and the three inputs we've added so far, with their associated labels. As the password field is a password input, when we enter text into it, we can't see what we've typed, only placeholder characters. This is so no one can see what we've typed. For this reason, it's common practice to include a password confirmation field, where the user has to enter the same value again to reduce the likelihood of the user typing in their desired password incorrectly. So let's add another password type input, but with different values for the ID and name attributes. Finally, in the form, we'll add a submit button. In the browser, there's the form. To add some styling to this, instead of developing some CSS from scratch, we'll use an existing style sheet. When doing back-end development, the simplest way to add styling to HTML is to use a classless style sheet. This means we don't have to add any classes or extra elements to the HTML. There are many classless CSS frameworks available. My current favorite is water.css. To use this, we just copy this link tag code and paste it in the head section of the HTML. Now in the browser, the sign-up form is nicely styled, just by adding one line of code to the HTML. Next, let's add a script to process this form when it's submitted. Let's add a new file called processsignup.php. Before we add any code in here, we'll add an action attribute to the form tag containing the name of this new script, so that when the form is submitted, this is where its data will be sent. While we're here, we'll also add a method attribute specifying the post method. This is the method to use if you're saving data on the server, which is what we'll be doing shortly. Back in the process signup script, let's start by adding the PHP opening tag. Just to make sure we're getting the data from the form correctly, let's just print out the post superglobal. In the browser, if we enter some data into the form and submit it, we get the values we entered printed out. The array keys are the values from the name attributes of the various inputs. Before we save this data, let's validate it. We'll start with the name. If the name element of the post array is empty, we'll just stop the script with a suitable message. Later on, we'll add some more user-friendly validation in the browser using JavaScript, so it's not necessary here to redisplay the form. This validation is just for the unlikely event that the client-side validation is bypassed, so it doesn't need to be more than this. Let's give that a try. If I submit the form with no value for the name, we get the message. If I enter a value, then we get the form data printed out as before. Next, let's validate the email address. To do this, we'll use the filter var function with the email validation filter. This returns false if the value passed in isn't a valid email address. So if this is false, we'll output a message as above. Before we try this, let's just disable the HTML validation in the form by adding the noValidate attribute to the form tag. As we're using an email input type, the browser will validate this as an email address. So we can test the server-side validation, we need to disable this. Let's give that a try. If I submit anything other than a valid email address, we get the message printed out. If it's a valid email address, the validation passes. Now we can validate the password. First, let's check that it's at least 8 characters long, which we can do using the string length function. Then we'll check that it contains at least one letter, which we'll do using the preg_match function. This matches the value to this regular expression. This will match any single lower or uppercase letter. This will return false if it doesn't match, so we can check for that. Then we'll use the same technique to check the password contains at least one number. Let's give that a try. If I enter a password that's too short, or one that doesn't contain a letter or a number, then validation doesn't pass. It only passes if I enter a valid password. Finally, let's validate the password confirmation field. For this, we simply check that the password field is equal to the password confirmation field. If it isn't, we'll output a message as before. Let's try that, and we see the validation if the passwords don't match. Now we have valid data for a user account that we can save. However, before we do that, note that we don't want to save the password in clear text like this. This is because if an attacker gets hold of the database, they then have a list of emails and passwords they can use to log into the site. Also, as people reuse the same email and password on different sites, the attacker could use these credentials to log into other sites too. Instead, we store the password as a hash. We can generate a hash from a plain text password using the password hash function. This can use various different algorithms, but it's simplest just to use the default. So let's call that function, passing in the value from the form and the default password flag. This will return the hash of the password as a string. So let's assign that to a variable and print it out. Let's give that a try. When I submit valid data, there's the hash of the password, in this case a 60-character string of seemingly random characters. If all you have is this hash value, there is no way to extract the original plain text password from it, so it's very secure. Now we have the data we want to save, we can create a database table to store it in. I'll do this in PHP MyAdmin. First, let's create a new database called LoginDB, accepting the default collation. Then we'll create a table in this database called user that will have 4 columns. We'll call the first column ID, which is an integer, and we'll check the auto increment checkbox, which will also make this the primary key. The next column will be for the name, and we'll make this a 128 character varchar. Next, the column for the email address, which will make a 255 character varchar, and we'll also specify a unique index on this column. This means that no 2 rows can have the same value for this column. The next column will be for the password hash, which we'll call password hash. Although the hash that we saw earlier was only 60 characters, the documentation for the password hash function recommends storing this in a field that's 255 characters long, as the algorithm could change over time, and the hash it returns could be a different length. So we'll create this field as a 255 character varchar. We'll save that, and there's the database table. Now we can connect to the database from PHP. As we're eventually going to be connecting to the database from more than one place, let's add a new file that will contain the database connection code. So we'll create a new file called database.php, and in here we'll start with the PHP opening tag. Next, let's create some variables to contain the connection details for the database. The host is the same as the web server localhost. The name of the database we just created is LoginDB, and we'll connect using the root account, which by default has a blank password. Note that connecting with the root account like this is only recommended when developing locally. To connect to the database, we'll create a new MySQL object, passing in the host, username, password, and database name. These variables have to be in this order, and it's a common error to get them in the wrong order. If you prefer, you can use named arguments by prefixing each value with the name of the argument. If you do this, it doesn't matter which order they're in. Before we can use this database connection, we need to make sure we connected OK. The connect error number property of the MySQL object is set to an error code from the most recent connection attempt. If there was no error, this is 0. So we can check for this by simply using this as the condition for an if statement. If a connection error has occurred, we'll stop the script and print out a message. We can get a description of the error in the connect error property. Finally, in this script, we'll return the MySQL variable. Back in the process signup script, let's require the database.php script we just added, using the dir constant to get the directory of the current file. As we put a return statement at the end of the database script, this will be what is returned from the require statement, so we can assign that to a variable. Let's give that a try. If I submit valid data, then we get the form data printed out as before. This means we've connected to the database successfully, as there was no error displayed. To check the error handling code, let's temporarily change the database password. And now if I refresh the page in the browser, we get the connection error displayed. This is the message you'll get if the connection credentials are incorrect. Let's just change that back so it's correct again. Now we've connected to the database, we can insert a new record into the user table. We'll use a prepared statement for this, as this will allow us to avoid an SQL injection attack. First, let's write the SQL. We'll use an SQL insert into statement, specifying the name, email, and password hash fields. The ID field is an auto-increment field, so if we don't specify it, a value will be inserted automatically. For the values, we'll use placeholders. Then we'll create a new prepared statement object by calling the statement init method on the MySQLi connection object. Next, we prepare the SQL statement for execution by calling the prepare method on the statement object, passing in the SQL string as an argument. It's at this point that any syntax errors in the SQL will be caught. If the prepare method returns false, then there's a problem with the SQL. To catch this, we can check for the return value, and if it's false, we'll stop the script and display the error detail, which we can get from the error property of the connection object. To test this, let's add a typo to the SQL string. And when we refresh the page in the browser, we see the error detail. Let's change that back to get rid of the error. Now we have the statement ready to execute, we can bind values to the placeholder characters. To do this, we call the bindParam method on the statement object. The first argument is a string that contains characters that specify the types of the variables. As all three variables are strings, the string is 3 S characters. We follow this string with the actual values, which are the name, email, and password hash. Finally, to execute the statement, we call the execute method on the statement object. Following this, instead of printing out the form data, for now, let's just print out a message. Let's give that a try. If I enter valid data into the form and submit it, we get the sign up successful message. If we have a look in the database, there's the record in the user table. Note the value for the ID column has been generated automatically. Note what happens though if we go back to the form and submit it again with exactly the same details. We still get the sign up successful message, but no additional record is inserted into the database. This is because we added a unique index on the email column in this table. That prevents more than one record having the same value in this column. So what we should do in this case is add some validation on the email address that prevents us from displaying the success message if a record with that email address already exists in the database. The execute method returns true if it was successful and false otherwise. So let's check for that, and if it's false, for now let's just print out the error message as we did above. In addition to the error description though, let's also add the error code, which we can get from the error number property. Now if we submit the form with the same details, we get a description of the error. We can improve this a step further by detecting the specific error. As we can see, the error code for this specific error, a duplicate key entry error, is 1062. So before this statement where we stop the script and display the error message, let's check the error number property, and if it's equal to 1062, we'll stop the script with a more specific error message, and otherwise we'll just continue as before. If we submit the same details again, now we get the specific validation message. If there's some other problem, then we'll get the error details for that printed out. If I go back and change the email address to one that doesn't already exist in the database, then we get the sign up successful message. Note what happens if I refresh the page at this point. We get a warning about a repeat form submission, and if we accept it, the form's data is submitted again, and we get the email validation error message. To avoid this, we'll use the post redirect get pattern. So instead of just echoing out this message, if the sign-up is successful, at this point we'll redirect to another page. So first, let's create a new file called signupsuccess.html. To keep this simple, I'll just copy the first part of the signup.html file and paste it in the signup success file. After the heading tag, we'll just add a paragraph tag containing the signup successful message, and then we'll close the body and HTML tags. Back in the process signup script, instead of outputting the message in here, we'll use the header function to send a location header with the address of the signup success file we just added. As we are redirecting at this point, it's good practice to exit the script immediately once we've sent the header. Let's give that a try. With valid data in the form, making sure I specify an email address that I know doesn't exist in the database. When I submit the form, we get redirected to the sign-up success page. Note that if I refresh this page, no warning is given about the form data being resubmitted. Now that a user can sign up, we can add a page for them to log in. Let's add a new file called login.php. We'll be putting some PHP code in this script, so it needs the PHP suffix. We'll start with the HTML for the login form. As before, to keep it simple, we'll just copy the start of the HTML from the sign-up page and paste it in the login script, although we'll change the contents of the title and header elements to login. We'll add a form, then the closing body and HTML tags. Inside the form, we'll add an input for the email address and an associated label. Then the equivalent for the password. And finally in the form, a submit button. Before we have a look at how this looks in the browser, let's add a link to this page to the Sign Up Success page. In the browser, now the Sign Up Success page has a link to the login page. If we click it, we see the login form. Instead of submitting the form to a separate script like the sign-up form, we'll process this form in the same script. So we don't need to add an action attribute to the form tag, but we will add a method attribute to specify the post method. Then, at the top of the file, before the HTML, we'll add the PHP opening and closing tags. To detect if the form has been submitted, we can check the request method. When we first click on the link to open the page, the method will be get. When the form is submitted with the button, it will be post. When the form is submitted, we need to check that the email and password entered into the form match one of the records in the database. We'll start by connecting to the database by requiring the database.php file. Then we'll write the SQL to select a record based on the email address. Remember, any column used in a where clause should have an index, as we do on the email column. Instead of using a prepared statement for this, we'll just insert the value for the email directly into the SQL. As the email is a string, we need to enclose it in single quotes in the where clause. To insert the value from the form, we'll use the sprintf function, putting a string placeholder in the string where we want the value to go, and passing in the value from the post array as the second argument of the function. To make sure we avoid an SQL injection attack, we need to escape the value coming from the form. We can do this with the real_escape_string method of the MySQLi object. Then, to execute this SQL, we call the query method on the MySQLi object, passing in the SQL. This returns a result object, so we'll assign that to a variable. To get the data from the result object, we call the fetch_assoc method. This will return the record, if one was found, as an associative array, so we'll assign that to a variable. For now, let's print out the contents of that variable and exit the script. Let's give that a try. If I don't enter anything, then we get null. If I enter an email address that I know doesn't exist in the database, then we also get null. If I enter an email address that I know exists in the database, then we get an associative array containing the data from that record. So instead of printing this out, let's check that the user variable contains an array of data and isn't null, which we can do with a simple if statement. If a record was found for that email address, then we can check the password. We're getting the plain text password from the form, but the value stored in the database is the password hash. To verify that the hash matches the plain text password, we use the password verify function. This returns true if they match and false otherwise. So let's check for that, and for now we'll just print out a message and stop the script. Now if I enter the correct details in the login form, we're shown the login successful message. However, if the credentials aren't correct, we're just shown a blank login form again. We can make this a bit more user-friendly. First, let's show a message telling the user that the login was invalid. At the top of the script, let's add a variable called isInvalid that we'll set to false. Then, at the end of the if block that's executed when the form is submitted, we'll set this to true. If we've reached this point in the script, the form has been submitted, but either the email or password was invalid. Then, in the HTML, if this variable is true, we'll display a message saying the login was invalid. Note that it's common practice to just say the login was invalid, rather than specifically the email or the password. This is to give as little information as possible to a potential attacker. Let's give that a try. When we first view the form, no message is shown. If I submit invalid credentials, we see the invalid login message. Note what happens though with the email address. If the login is invalid, the form is redisplayed, but the email address field is blank again. It's most likely that the user got the password wrong and not the email address, as the password is masked when it's typed in. So it would be more user-friendly if we keep the value of the email input when redisplaying the form. To do this, let's add a value attribute to the email input, specifying the email element of the post array. When we first load the form, this will be empty, so we'll use the null coalescing operator to default this to an empty string. As this is untrusted content, we also need to escape it using the HTML special chars function. Now if we enter an email in the form and submit it, the value is remembered when the form is redisplayed. If I enter valid credentials, we're shown the login successful message. Instead of showing this message, we can now log the user in. To do this, we'll store the user ID in a session. Sessions are used to remember values between browser requests. PHP handles this automatically by generating and storing a unique session ID in a browser cookie that's used to uniquely identify the user. Before we do this in here, let's add a new file where we can show if the user is logged in or not. So let's add a new file called index.php and add the PHP opening and closing tags. In here, in order to use the session, we call the session start function. This will either start a new session or resume an existing one. Once the session is started, we can store values in the session superglobal, and they'll persist across requests. So for now, let's just print that out. If we open the index.php page in a browser, we just get an empty array printed out. Back in the login script, instead of printing out this message, we'll start or resume the session, then store the user ID in the session superglobal. By default, these values are stored in files on the server, so it's best practice to just store a small amount of information in the session. Once we've done this, let's redirect to the index page and exit the script. Let's give that a try. On the index page, the session array is empty. If we go to the login page and log in with valid credentials, we're redirected to the index page, and now the session array contains the ID of the user. If I refresh this page, then the value persists. Now we can quickly add some HTML to the index page. First, again to keep it simple, we'll copy the head section of the HTML from the login page and paste it after the PHP in the index page, changing the contents of the title and header elements. Following this, let's check to see if the user ID is set in the session, and if it is, we'll just output a message. If it's not set, let's display links to the login and sign up pages. Finally, we'll add the closing body and HTML tags. And at the top, we'll remove this line that's printing out the session array. Let's give that a try. If I refresh the page from before, we get the logged in message. To check how this looks when we're not logged in, we need to add logout functionality. So let's add a new file called logout.php. In here, we'll add the PHP opening tag. Then to destroy the session, we call the session destroy function. Once we've done that, let's redirect back to the index page. Note how we don't need the PHP closing tag in here, as this file just contains PHP, and how we don't technically need an exit line, as it's the last line of the script, but it's good practice to always include this after sending a location header. In the index page, let's add a link to this inside the block that's shown when the user is logged in. Let's give that a try. If I refresh the page, now we see the logout link. However, if I click it, nothing happens. We get redirected back to the index page, but we haven't been logged out. In the logout page, although we're calling the session destroy function, what I didn't include was a call to the session start function first. Anytime you use the session, you need to call session start. So let's add that. And now when I click the logout link, we're redirected back to the index page and we've been logged out. If we log in again, we're shown the logged in message on the index page. Let's make this a bit more user-friendly and display the name of the logged in user. So in the index page, after we've started the session, let's check for the user ID value in the session array. If this is set, we can retrieve the user record from the database that corresponds to this ID. So we'll require the database script to get the connection, then write the SQL to select the user record where the ID equals the value in the session. This value isn't untrusted content, as it's a value we've set in the session ourselves, so we don't need to escape it. Then we'll run that using the query method on the MySQLi object, passing in the SQL to get a result object. And finally, we'll get an associative array containing the record's values using the fetchAssoc method, and assigning this to a variable. Then, in the HTML, instead of checking the session, we'll just check to see if the user variable is set. Then, instead of outputting this message, we'll print out a greeting that includes the user's name, making sure we escape it with the HTML special chars function as it's untrusted content. Before we try this, there's one more thing that we need to add to the login page. As we're starting the session at the top of the index page, when we load the login page, the session will already be started. This could make the code vulnerable to a session fixation attack. To avoid this, once we've logged in successfully, we regenerate the session ID by calling the session regenerate ID function. Let's give that a try. If I refresh the page once we're logged in, we see the personalized message. That covers the basics of how to sign up and log in with PHP. However, we can make the sign up page more user-friendly by adding some client-side validation using JavaScript. To do this, I'll use the JustValidate JavaScript validation library. This has no dependencies and is available on a CDN, so all we need to do to include it is to copy this script tag and paste it in the head section of the sign-up form. Let's also add a new file that will contain the custom JavaScript for this page. First, let's add a new folder called JS. Then inside here, a new file called validation.js. Then, back in the sign-up page, let's add another script tag after the one we just added to load this file. Let's also add defer attributes to these two so that we ensure they're loaded in order. I won't go into detail on how this library works, as the documentation here is comprehensive and is there if you need to refer to it. First, so that we can easily identify the form, let's add an ID attribute to the form tag. Then, in the validation.js file, we'll create a new justValidate object, passing in the selector for the form. Next, we can add validation rules for each field. Let's start with the name. We call the addField method on the validation object, with the field selector as the first argument, and an array of rules as the second. Each rule is an object, where we can specify one of the library's built-in rules using the rule property, with the name of the rule as the value. For the name, let's just make it required. Before we add any more rules, let's try that to make sure it's working so far. In the sign-up form, now if I try to submit it with an empty name, we get the required field validation message printed out below the input, and the input focus is placed in that input. If I type a value, the validation message is removed. Next, let's add some validation on the email input. We'll make it required, and also that it's a valid email address. In the browser, now the email field is required and also needs to be a valid email address. Next, the password, which we'll make required, and also use the password rule, which requires the password to be at least 8 characters and contain at least one letter and at least one number. In the browser, now the password is validated. Next, we'll validate the password confirmation input. There isn't a built-in rule to validate that two fields are equal, but we can add a custom validation rule with the validator property. The value is a function that takes two arguments, the value of the input being validated, and an array of the other fields in the form. If we return true from this function, then it's considered valid, and invalid if false is returned. So we can just return the result of comparing the equality of the field value and the value of the password field. Let's also specify a custom error message for when this field is invalid, which we do using the error message property. In the browser, now the password confirmation field is validated to match the password. Once all the validation has passed, we need to manually submit the form, as the validation library has prevented this default behavior. We do this by calling the onSuccess method, passing in a callback function. In this function, we'll get the form element and call the submit method on it. In the browser, now if the validation passes, the form submits again. However, one thing we're not validating is that the email address isn't taken. If I submit the form again with the same details, we get the server-side email validation message. To validate if the email address is available or not, we have to check this in the database, so we'll have to make a request to the server. First, let's create a new file called validateemail.php and put in the PHP opening tag. In here, all we want to do is check the user table to see if a record already exists with a given email address. So first, let's connect to the database by requiring the database file. Then we'll write some SQL to select any records from the database where the email is equal to a value that we'll pass in using the query string. We'll use the sprintf function to insert the value from the query string into the SQL, making sure we escape it. Then we'll run it using the query method. To see if the email address exists, we can check the number of rows in the result set. And if this is 0, the email address is available, so we'll assign that Boolean value to a variable. As we'll be making this request from JavaScript, we'll output this as JSON. So let's add the JSON content type header and output the isAvailable variable as JSON. Before we call that from JavaScript, let's test it in the browser. We'll call the validate email script, passing in an email address in the query string. This email address already exists in the database, so we get some JSON that says this isn't available. If I try an email address that doesn't exist in the database, we get true. Now we can call this from the JavaScript validation code. As with the password confirmation field, we'll add a custom validator to the email field. We don't need the fields argument to the callback function, as all we need is the value of the field. Inside this function, we'll make a request using fetch to the script we just added. We'll add the value of the field from the form in the query string, making sure we URI encode it. This returns a promise object, so we can then call the then method on that, passing in a function to parse the JSON response and return this as a JavaScript object. This in turn returns a promise object, so we can call then on that, passing in a function that simply returns the value of the available property, which will be true or false, as we just saw in the browser. Finally, we'll return this promise from the custom validator function. In addition to the custom validator, let's also add a custom error message. Let's give that a try. If I enter an email address that already exists in the database, we get the email already taken message. If I change it to one that doesn't exist in the database, the validation passes and we see the sign up successful message. Note, this client-side validation doesn't replace the server-side validation. It's important to always have server-side validation, as the client-side validation can be bypassed. So now you know how to create sign-up, login and logout using PHP, SQL, HTML and JavaScript. There's a link to all the code shown in this video in the description, along with links to sites shown and relevant documentation. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.